condition. Inspect the underside of the belt. Replace the belt if it's cracked, cut, frayed, or glazed. If the previous inspections have failed to uncover the problem, the cause is likely a failed alternator or bad voltage regulator. Never attempt to test the alternator by disconnecting the battery cable with the engine running. The spike voltage produced by disconnecting the battery cable can cause internal damage to the alternator and can damage the onboard computer if your car has one. Let's take a look at how to replace your alternator. The tools you'll need are a 1/4-inch drive socket set, a set of wrenches, possibly metric and American, a battery terminal puller, a wood pry bar, and some hand cleaner and hand towels for cleaning up afterwards. The first step in replacing the alternator is to disconnect the negative battery cable from the battery. This will eliminate the chance of an electrical short damaging other parts of the electrical system. Now remove the wires from the back of the alternator, noting their positions for reattachment. Loosen and remove the adjustment bolt, which attaches through the slotted hole in the alternator bracket. Loosen the pivot bolt, but don't remove it at this time. You should be able to move the alternator now. Move the alternator inward and relieve the tension on the belt and remove the fan belt from the alternator pulley. Hold the alternator with one hand and remove the pivot bolt that holds the alternator to the engine. Watch closely for any spacers that may be used on this mounting bolt and note their position for reattachment. Remove the alternator from the engine. If you need a replacement alternator, be sure to compare your old alternator with the replacement. Remove any brackets or wire looms from the old alternator and install them on the replacement. Place the new alternator in position and install a pivot bolt and any spacers that may be used. Install a pivot bolt by hand at this time. Install the adjusting bolt in the slotted bracket, but don't tighten it yet. Slip the fan belt over the alternator pulley. Make sure the belt is aligned correctly on any other pulleys that it may go around. Using a piece of wood as a lever, or using hand pressure, pull the alternator to tighten the belt. Tighten the adjustment bolt. Be careful not to over-tighten the belt, as this may cause damage or premature failure to the bearings in the alternator. We suggest tightening the belt so there is no belt slippage if the pulley is turned by hand. Now securely tighten the pivot bolt. Reconnect the wires to the back of the alternator. Clean and reconnect the negative battery cable. We suggest applying a little grease or battery protectant on the battery connection to help prevent corrosion of the cable end. Start the engine. Check to see that all the belts are operating correctly. Stop the engine. Recheck all the bolts for tightness. Drive the vehicle for 200 miles and recheck the belt tension.
Let's review replacing your alternator. First, disconnect the negative battery cable. Then disconnect the alternator wiring. Remove the alternator adjustment bolt and loosen the pivot bolt. Tip the alternator and remove the drive belt. Remove the pivot bolt and any spacers. Remove the old alternator and compare it to the new one. Install the new alternator, pivot bolt, and adjustment bolt. Install the drive belt to the correct tension and tighten the alternator bolts. Reconnect the alternator wires and the negative battery cable. Start the engine and check for correct operation.
You depend on your starter to crank and start the engine each time you turn the key. Over the course of a single year, this will add up to as many as 1,500 times. The severity of each one of these initial startups varies with the weather and the condition of your car's engine. Symptoms to look for to determine if your starter is in need of replacement are slow cranking, a spinning noise indicating a starter that doesn't engage, a loud screeching noise indicating a starter that doesn't disengage, a clicking noise when the key is turned on, or of course, no starting at all. If any of these symptoms are detected, a few simple checks should be made before replacing the starter. First, inspect all the cables and connections from the battery to the starter to make sure they are tight and free from corrosion. Clean any corrosion, tighten any loose connections, and replace any deteriorated parts. If you have a serviceable type battery, check the fluid level in the cells and check the state of charge with a voltmeter or hydrometer. Inspect all the wiring to the starter and replace any wires that are broken, brittle, or burnt. If a clicking noise is heard, the starter solenoid may be the faulty component. The solenoid may look like one of these and may be mounted on the firewall or inner fender well, or it may look like this and be mounted to the starter itself. If no sound is heard at all when the key is turned on to the start position, a check of the neutral safety switch or the ignition switch should be performed before starter replacement. Let's take a look at a typical starter replacement. The tools you'll need are a socket and wrench set, a set of screwdrivers, a jack and a set of jack stands, and some hand cleaner and shop towels for cleaning up afterwards. The first step is to disconnect a negative battery cable to prevent possible electrical shorts of the wires while working on them. On vehicles where the starter must be removed from the underside of the car, block the rear tires and raise the vehicle with a jack. Place jack stands to support the frame rails. Never work underneath a car without the safety of a set of jack stands. Now disconnect the wires attached to the starter or solenoid. Remove the starter mounting bolts and starter brace if so equipped. Support the starter while removing the last bolt and remove the starter from its mounting surface. Care should be taken when removing the starter, as many starters are heavy. Some General Motors vehicles may have shims between the starter and the engine block. If so, save these shims for reinstallation with the new starter. When replacing a starter, we suggest installing new solenoid to ensure proper operation once installed. Support the new starter and start the mounting bolts by hand. Be sure to reinstall any shims and brackets that have been removed originally. Tighten the mounting bolts securely with a wrench, following the recommended torque specifications. Reconnect the battery cable and any other wires that are attached to the starter or solenoid. Reinstall the negative battery cable. Make sure the vehicle is in park or neutral with the parking brake applied, and test the new starter for proper operation. Listen for any unusual noises. If any are heard, loosen the starter attaching bolts, check the position of the starter, or add additional shims. Retighten the mounting bolts and recheck the operation. Remove the jack stands and let the vehicle down off the jack. You're done. You've saved yourself an expensive repair bill and have the pride of doing the job yourself.
Let's quickly review replacing your starter. First, disconnect the negative battery cable. Raise and support the vehicle securely if necessary for starter access. Disconnect the starter wiring. Remove the starter bolts and any braces or brackets. Carefully remove the starter and any shims that may be present. Compare the old and new starters. Place the new starter in position and restart the bolts by hand. Reinstall any shims that were removed. Tighten the mounting bolts to the correct torque specification. Reinstall the starter wiring and the negative battery cable. Start the vehicle to check for proper operation.